This program is a presentation of UCTV for educational and non-commercial use only.
First of all, I would like to say that my presentation will be limited to a theme which is rules and constraints of artistic creation, the neurobiologist viewpoint. And the first slides I will show is just to simply illustrate that there is indeed a genetic envelope to the origin of art and aesthetics in the human lineage. And one of the first steps, of course, is the discovery of tools, which take place with Homo habilis about 2.5 million years ago. The brain at this stage was only 600 cubic millimeter. And the second step, if I may say, is the discovery of symmetry. Since you may have noticed that the first tools were rather rough and without very definite shape, and with Homo erectus 1.5 million years ago, and with a brain of 800 cubic millimeter, symmetry is indeed present with these bifas, which were collected here in Ethiopia. Now, another step which is important is the discovery of symbolism with Homo heidelbergensis 300,000 years ago. And the brain now is significantly larger, approaching that of Homo sapiens. And these were found in Aven Sepulchral in Spain. And one can notice funerary settings and funerary offerings. And last but not least, of course, is the discovery of artistic composition, which is appearing 100,000 years ago with Homo sapiens, and a brain of 1,400 cubic millimeter, which is the volume, approximative volume of our brain. So there is clearly some kind of genetic envelope for the evolutionary origins of art. And perhaps as a next stage in my presentation, I would like to try to define what is art and aesthetics. And the first point I would like to underline is that work of art is human production, some kind of artifact, which I view as specialized for intersubjective communication, to use symbolic forms, which could either be genetically or epigenetically, it means learned, encoded. And second, it's clear that works of art do not belong to language as such. It's a non-verbal communication, primarily of emotional states, knowledge, experience, with a diversity of codes at variance with language. Yet there are constraints, rules, what in French one may call the règles de l'art, and I will try to define what they are in the second part of my presentation. And what is seemingly one of the most characteristic features of works of art is where they have some kind of aesthetic efficacy, staggering effects that we have to further define on emotion and reason as well, which mobilize both conscious and non-conscious processes. And last but not least, art is in constant evolution. There is indeed an art history, And having seen the Grotte Chauvet as the first slide, you may question, is there any progress in art or simply an adaptive renewal that one may see throughout the years since these early origins of art. But we shall have, of course, we are fortunate enough to have paleoanthropologists among us who are going to tell us what are the first creations in art of human beings. Now, just to be more biologist and neurobiologist, I would like to say that, of course, artistic creation is done by our brains and the brains of our ancestors. And I would like to say that from the outset that we may view it as a synthesis of multiple nested evolutionary processes. Of course, those I just mentioned at the gene level, but also other processes which are taking place during brain development. And one may emphasize the fact that the human brain takes 15 years at least to develop and fully develop through postnatal synaptic epigenesis. So there is a nested epigenetic evolution within the genetic evolution, of course, at a different time scale. But we have also, as you know, change of synaptic efficacies which are taking place at the level of our brain connections in the time scale of hundreds of milliseconds to seconds. And these are linked, of course, to the mental or psychological times for thinking and creating. And in addition to this kind of fast evolution, there is, in addition, of course, the cultural and social evolution, which is taking place at a much larger scale and most likely involve extracerebral memories like the works of arts. Now, having these ideas in mind, I will say two things mainly. Make 2 points. First, how does the processing of the visual image is taking place? I am only speaking here about visual arts, but of course there are other arts like music and so on. And then in the second part of this brief presentation, I will discuss the rules of art to further define what may be called a work of art. And as you may imagine, of course, there is a bottom-up processing of the visual image from our retina through our visual system, cortex, primary and secondary cortical area, and then parietal and temporal cortical areas for the perception of movement, of death, spatial organization, and ground figure segregation from the dorsal pathway, and the recognition of objects, recognition of faces, perception of colors through ventral pathway. Now, all these processes are meeting at the level of the prefrontal cortex, and throughout this processing of piece of art, there is, of course, an evocation of stored images and emotions, and therefore a very strong impression of emotion taking place during this processing. And there is, of course, as you know, a system devoted for this emotion processing, which is the limbic system, and Antonio Damasio is going to talk about this. And what I would like to say is that it is interesting to view these final steps in the processing of the visual image as taking place through a very rich interconnection between the limbic system and the prefrontal cortex. And that's where I believe, this is an hypothesis, of course, I wish to propose, that aesthetic efficacy is due to the access to consciousness of these images and emotion which have been processed non-consciously beforehand and have a non-access to space, which I call the global neuronal workspace, which might originate, and this is our hypothesis, from a set of long axon neurons which are heavily interconnected and are using, are broadcasting signals to multiple areas and yield the subjective experience of what may be called the artistic contemplation. This notion of global neuronal workspace has been developed with Stanislas Dehaene during the past decade, and as I said, is based on the occurrence of these sets of long-range connections which interconnect the prefrontal, the parieto-temporal, and cingulate cortex. And you can see this old slide of MacLean that already emphasized the relationship between the limbic and the prefrontal cortex. And the proposal here, which is again a hypothesis to further discuss, there is some kind of discrete mental synthesis which of multiple parallel and distributed processes, which is going to take place at this level and give what I would call this aesthetic experience. Now you can see this image and ask, was it a man's face or a woman? Answer? Well, and this is simply that one of these images having access to consciousness, and this is just to illustrate that one can in fact now have an objective investigation on access to consciousness through this kind of experiment, where here this set of slides are shown to the subject. Here, when one asks the subject, have you seen something? He said, yes, lion. If now you have the same slides, but the order is different, the masks are in between note, then the subject does not report anything subjectively viewed. So this is visible, and here it is not visible, but consciously, non-consciously processed by the brain. Now, if you look at the brain images, which were again obtained by Stanislas Dehaene and colleagues, you can realize that, in fact, for conscious processing, you have indeed the mobilization of the prefrontal cortical areas, but this is not taking place to the same extent in the case of non-conscious processing. So why not to view the aesthetic experience as being precisely the conscious access to the global workspace? This is the hypothesis I simply wish to put forward. Now, I would like to close on other issues. Work of art is not simply a clock or a bottle of wine or landscapes. There is something more in the definition of a work of art, and I think to introduce this notion, I would like to quote a statement by Braque, "J'aime la règle qui corrige l'émotion." In English, it is, "I love the rule which corrects the emotion." And I think this is a very profound statement for us, since indeed our brain is so complex and there are so many interconnections that everything is possible. Our brain might even explode if, I would say, under the possibilities of combinations which are possibly established between nerve cells. And therefore, what is characteristic of a piece of art is that there is indeed a restriction of these possible combinations. And that's what I call an efficient rule, which is most often implicit in the case of the artist, which restricts in the top-down manner the number of possible representations, which creates what I would call the style of the artist. And these rules may be viewed, but this is still something to investigate. Again, it's the program for future research. Quite pattern of connections, some kind of scaffoldings, which would be stored in long-term memory and constrain the artist's gesture. So what are these rules? Of course, first of all, you are not going to forgive an artist to repeat himself or to repeat the work of somebody else. So novelty is one of the rules, the constant search for the unanticipated. Now, this is not sufficient, of course, but you may have neural basis for novelty with this brain imaging of surprise, where indeed you can see the prefrontal cortex is activated. This is from the work of Reichel and Posner. When you are used to see something, then you get bored or desensitized, and the prefrontal cortex is becoming silent, or not completely silent, but at least there is less activity. And now if you show a novel piece of art, then there is reactivation of this prefrontal cortex. So there is indeed some kind of neural basis for novelty or surprise. Now, this is not sufficient, of course. And another characteristic of what may be defined as a piece of art is what I called consensus partium, following, of course, Alberti at the Renaissance, who get this definition, which is the universal search for harmony. This is not a Platonician kind of principle. It is something which I consider as being neurally based. And this is what may be called the coherence of the parts within the whole. And just to illustrate this point, I would like to show the photographs of the work which preceded, anticipated this beautiful painting of Matisse in Baltimore Museum. And here are a few of the steps, and they are all by Matisse himself, of course. And you can see where he started, and when you compare where he started to how he finished, you may say, well, I could not believe that this is by Matisse, but yet it was from Matisse. And then he progressively, through this tedious work, finally reached this stage that he considered as final, and where all the parts were indeed consistent with the whole. Now, is there a neural basis for that? Well, there are few experiments along these lines, and these are from the group of Kramann from Germany, where the subject has to compare a picture which is symmetrical with another one which is non-symmetrical and supposed to be beautiful. So this is, I wish to ask your forgiveness, something very, very crude and primitive as a test for beauty. But this can be improved, of course. Yet you can see that there is a very striking difference between what may be called aesthetic judgment from symmetry judgment. And again, these prefrontal, temporal, parieto-temporal networks of these long-range connections are being mobilized in the aesthetic judgment. Now, there is also something else, and the list is not closed for the artist, is to convey a message. When we see these lions from Grotte Chauvet, they had a significance, for sure. So there is something that the artist had to convey to the public, to the spectator. And I would use the word of Poussin, exemplum, what the artist wants the spectator to share with him, his conception of the world. And I just want to illustrate this aspect with these beautiful paintings from Pablo Picasso of the Minotaur. And I would say that an important function of art is to make us aware. And is there a neural basis for that? I think there is, of course. There are a lot of studies being done now about empathy. And here is the comparison of the brain images which are obtained by a person who suffers from electrical stimulus, and another one which sees the person suffering from the electrical stimulus. And you can see that there are many circuits which are in common, others are different. And there are, we may see that there are indeed neural circuits of empathy. And my conclusion would be that art makes us aware of oneself as another. Now I am finishing. This is my next to last slide with another rule which I may consider as important as well, which is schematization. And just to raise a question for the paleoanthropologists who are going to speak after me. This is from Grotte Chauvet, and you have these dots and you have this horse. What about realism and abstraction? This is, as you know, a very important issue in even contemporary art. But I would like to quote Herbert Simon, who said the beauty of a scientific proposition lies in the fact that it explains much from little. And I leave you with this statement. Now, to conclude, I would say that we have to further discuss, and I am not going to talk about this, the evolutionary origins of art and aesthetics in the framework of Darwinian evolution, sexual selection, group selection, intersubjective communication, social bonding, or even simply a byproduct of brain evolution. Thank you very much. And I want to just say that I wish to acknowledge not only the Institut Pasteur and Collège de France, but you see this Casque School of Pharmacy and Palmer Taylor for being my host, and of course CARTA and Ajit Varkin, the Kavli Foundation. Thank you very much.